Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, but we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely. With me today, of course, is co-founder of the Gaggle, Peter Lavelle. So, Peter, we've spoken in the recent past about Russia's warning that it's on the brink of rewriting its nuclear doctrine, and indeed that has happened. And so Putin held a
Kind of
meeting.
surprises me. I'm a
Yeah,
little surprised, to be honest.
that's right. You're surprised?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay.
And I'm happily surprised. Yeah.
I think so too. And I think that so Putin held a meeting of the National Security Council in the Kremlin the other day, and he outlined the new nuclear doctrine. So keep in mind, he had always Russia's nuclear doctrine had always had at its core, first of all, obviously, Russia will respond with nuclear weapons in the event of a nuclear attack. But there was also the provision that Russia will respond with nuclear weapons in the event of an attack that poses an existential threat to Russia. So in other words, it will respond with nuclear weapons to a conventional attack. No, there's nothing so special about that. Remember, NATO's strategy was also that. The nuclear doctrine of NATO was exactly that. In the event of a conventional attack with the Warsaw Pact, NATO reserved the right to resort to nuclear weapons. So they didn't say, "Oh, we will only resort to nuclear weapons in event." So there's a lot of condemnation of Russia. Oh, you're using nuclear in response to conventional, but that was also NATO's doctrine. But anyway, under the
Anyway, just to add on what you just said there, the reason why NATO did that before the end of the Cold War is that, as we see today, the huge industrial base that the Soviet Union had and Russia still has today is that they could just marshal a lot of soldiers, a lot of artillery, a lot of tanks, heavy industrial conventional stuff. And the Europeans, and this is also part of nuclear doctrine, more bang for the buck.
right.
Okay, so you would say, okay, we don't have to meet them one to one conventionally because it would be very, very expensive. And of course, after the Second World War, everybody wanted the welfare state, and some countries like the Netherlands, Denmark, Germany, Austria had very nice welfare states.
Right.
Why? Because they had a nuclear doctrine that George just described.
That's exactly right. And what you said is correct. This is the bigger bang for the buck because they say, hey, this is pretty neat. We have this nuclear weapons. It's relatively inexpensive in comparison to having huge standing armies, and it's a deterrent. And so, if it's a deterrent, basically that prevents anyone from attacking us. So why should we do more? Why should we spend more? And particularly, it was very nice because most of the European countries didn't even have to spend any money on this deterrent. It was the Americans who had the deterrent. So it was a very nice arrangement. But foolishly, the same NATO powers have basically thrown the deterrence theory out the window, and now
Right.
they've got a problem on their hands because, having done this, we don't care about nuclear weapons. They've essentially triggered a Russian response, which means that, yeah, we're going to basically lower the threshold under which we can use nuclear weapons. So it was basically it's an own goal. It was a
Well,
nice
and
deal, and now you messed it up.
it's the worst of both worlds because you're relying upon your nuclear deterrent and you want to reinvent a conventional deterrence. I mean, this is the worst possible outcome that we could have gotten.
Right,
If the NATO had just let things be,
right.
we wouldn't be in this situation.
That's
Go ahead.
exactly. And letting things be means that we just don't mess in Russia's backyard. I mean, it's just they don't like it. They feel very threatened, and we just call it off when they ask us to call it off, and then ask us again and again and again. But we still
And
want
what would NATO lose by doing that, George?
nothing.
Nothing.
Absolutely nothing. Nothing.
Nothing.
Nothing at all. Nothing at all. Anyway, so this was um the meeting that took place in the Kremlin, and you can see here that this is a meeting of the Permanent Conference on the Security Council on Nuclear Deterrence. And here, this is Putin is speaking. Today, the nuclear triad remains the most important guarantee of the security of our state and citizens, an instrument for maintaining strategic parity and the balance of power in the world. At the same time, we see that the modern military political situation is changing dynamically, and we are obliged to take this into account, including the emergence of new sources of military threats and risks for Russia and our allies. It is important to predict the development of the situation and accordingly adapt the provisions of the strategic planning document to current realities.
George, if I could just interject real quick here. This, reading those 3 bullet points reminds me how much I don't miss the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, because they would say, as Lenin said in 1918, and going back to Marx and Engels in 1873, and the proletariat, that would have to go 3 paragraphs through that before you even know what you're talking about. Right. This is easy to understand.
It was very crisp. But this whole meeting, you get it on the Kremlin website, very, very short. There's no long preambles, no long speeches. It's very, very, very succinct and to the point. And then it says, over the past year, specialists from the Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Security Council Office, and other departments have conducted a deep, comprehensive analysis and assessed the need to adjust our approaches to the possible use of nuclear forces. Based on the results of this work, it has been proposed to make a number of clarifications in terms of defining the conditions for the use of nuclear weapons. And then he says, thus the draft principles expands the category of states and military alliances in relation to which nuclear deterrence is carried out, and supplements the list of military threats for the neutralization of which nuclear deterrence measures are carried out.
The subtext is we're not going to play along with NATO's fraudulent interpretation of deterrence.
That's exactly right. And then what else I would like to draw your attention to is that the updated version of the document, aggression against Russia by any non-nuclear state, but with the participation or support of a nuclear state, is proposed to be considered as their joint attack on the Russian Federation. So that in a way is saying that would not necessarily, but could trigger the use of Russian nuclear weapons. So it's aggression against Russia by a non-nuclear state, but with the participation of the support of a nuclear state.
It's giving clarification of what the threshold point is.
Right.
And right. It's crystal clear.
Right, exactly. And its relevance, obviously, to Ukraine is, as you said, crystal clear. Aggression, non-nuclear state, but with the participation or support of a nuclear state. And NATO, of course, consists of 3 nuclear states. And then the conditions for Russia's transition to the use of nuclear weapons are also clearly stated. We will consider this possibility upon receipt of reliable information about a massive launch of air and space attack weapons and their crossing of our state border. I mean strategic and tactical aircraft, cruise missiles, drones, hypersonic, and other aircraft. So again,
I like this. I really like that last sentence. Basically, what he's saying, for those that think this may be ambiguous, I mean
strategic and tactical aircraft, cruise missiles, drones, hypersonic, and other aircraft. So it's a fairly comprehensive list. But again, keep in mind, conventional. He's talking here about a conventional attack. So again, that could trigger Russia's use of nuclear weapons. A conventional attack doesn't have to be a nuclear attack. A conventional attack, a massive launch of air and space attack weapons, and they're crossing our state border, and that's it. Strategic.
And Russia will decide for itself what massive means.
Right, exactly. But again, it does not have to be nuclear. So it's basically spelling out in far greater detail than the previous doctrine, which said, oh, well, an existential threat to the Russian state, which is kind of vague. What does that mean? But this is a much more specific. And then we reserve the right to use nuclear weapons in case of aggression against Russia and Belarus as a member of the Union state. All these issues have been agreed upon with the Belarusian side and with the president of Belarus, including if the enemy using conventional weapons creates a critical threat to our sovereignty. Again, including if the enemy using conventional weapons creates a critical threat to our sovereignty.
It's very interesting that Belarus is being mentioned at this point in time because there are those that believe that with the ultimate failure of the Kursk incursion, Belarus could be subject to the same. So
Right.
um, I think it's very interesting that being very, very specific, not only is it part of the Union state, but Belarus, in the eyes of some NATO military planners, may be in the mix.
Well, I think so because Belarus is, in terms of population, is relatively small, and therefore could easily be the victim of an attack by Ukraine, by Poland. So that's why it's important to say, yeah, I mean that in any threat to the security and sovereignty of Belarus would, possibly trigger the use of nuclear weapons. So that's a very expansive presentation, and clearly now the West, oh, this is nuclear saber rattling. We have the usual response. Um, but the problem, as we said this many times before, when you say that, is, well, how do you know this? That's the whole point. I mean, you can't just simply say, oh, it's nuclear saber rattling. It would be irresponsible to take the risk. Even if it's one chance in 100, if it's one chance in a
Yeah,
thousand, it still doesn't make sense to take that risk.
but the Russians wouldn't dare. Look
Yeah,
at their nuclear doctrine. They wouldn't dare. Well, here it is
right,
for everyone to see. This is public information, all
right,
right? And we
exactly.
know that the pathological liar known as Blinken, the Undertaker, he responded to it at the United Nations this week here. And what he apparently he just is so dense they can't even understand it. These are very simple
Right.
tenets right now. This is
That's
not saber rattling. As a matter of fact, it's just the reverse. It is saying, look, nobody wants to go down this path. We're making it very clear to people, to the world, to particularly to nuclear powers. This is how we sit.
right.
Okay. I think it's eminently responsible to do
Right.
this.
I absolutely. And when the NATO powers start talking about deep strikes inside Russia and thinking, well, we can just do this without getting a serious response back. I mean, that is the height of complete idiocy. And that's why Russia is issuing these warnings. Now, the thing about Russia is that it is extremely patient. I mean, that it is very, very patient. You got patient, you get slapped and you get slapped again and slapped again. But there's always a point at which patience runs out. And you can't just go on assuming that you can, you've got a free hand to just keep slapping somebody. It makes no sense, particularly when the stakes are so high. I mean, nuclear weapons. Now those are very high stakes. I mean, that's a big deal, and we know that the stakes are very high here. Ukraine is, and we've known this for a long time. Ukraine is a very special case for Russia, and then basically sooner or later Russia's patience will inevitably run out.
Well, okay. So if NATO is going to target a Russian city with one of its missiles from Ukraine, then what we're seeing here, George has already made it very clear numerous times. Reaction does not necessarily, the Russian reaction does not necessarily have to mean nuclear. It can be conventional, and
Right,
they have very, very powerful conventional
right,
missiles
right.
and strategic missiles that are not nuclear. So you want to shoot into Russia? Maybe Russia will shoot into Poland.
Right, exactly. And that would be the first step. I mean, it wouldn't be exactly, that wouldn't be but the point was that yeah, that would be the next step in the escalation. You're not going to resort to nuclear weapons right away. Why would you do that? But it means that we're now ready for this confrontation with NATO, and that could well end up with, I mean, that's what it had always been assumed. I mean, throughout the Cold War, that even if you start with shooting with conventional weapons, that it will inevitably spiral to the use of nuclear weapons. So he's not saying anything unusual here. Yeah, we're going to start at the bottom rung of the ladder, but understand where that ladder goes. And so there's nothing so new about that. But naturally, the response in the media has been dismissive. With nuclear option unlikely, Putin struggles to defend his red lines. This is the Washington Post. There's a growing realization in the Kremlin that the West is not falling for its nuclear threats, and Putin is searching for new ways to enforce his red lines. So the West is not falling for, well, I mean, that's a problem for the West. It's not a problem for Russia. It's a problem for the West that you don't believe clear, unambiguous warnings.
Yeah, they seem to know Russia's red lines better than Russia does. It's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And then he says, this is
Catherine Belton.
Catherine Belton, exactly.
She used to be a correspondent here in Russia.
Yeah, that's right. She wrote a book about whatever it was called, Putin the oligarch, or Putin the kleptocrat, or something like that. When Russian President Vladimir Putin warned earlier this month that Western approval for Ukraine to strike deep inside Russia would mean Moscow was at war with NATO, Russian propagandists rushed to rattle the nuclear saber. But inside the Kremlin, there's a growing recognition that the repeated use of the nuclear threat is starting to lose its potency. And Moscow's red lines are constantly being crossed. Analysts and officials close to senior Russian diplomats said instead that Putin is casting around for a more nuanced and limited response to the West, allowing Ukraine to use longer range missiles to strike Russia. Oh, that's nice.
Putin is not casting around. I don't know why they would. I can't for the life of me think why they would use that word.
But I like this. I mean, he's for a more nuanced and limited response. Well, that's convenient. Oh, it's going to be very limited. Allowing so in exchange for the West being allowed to use long-range missiles inside Russia, Russia will do something minor, some nuance, do something annoying here and there. Well, that's nice. Isn't that a happy outcome? We're free to use long-range missiles inside Russian territory, and then Russia will do something nuanced somewhere or other, which no one cares about.
Yeah, well, I mean, destroying an arms depot or a airport for military hardware in Poland would not be minor, limited.
No, I don't think that's what they mean. I think what they mean is something like giving arms to the Houthis, something like there's no symmetry there.
Yeah, I mean, Georgia and I have been over this territory, and the smart people over at Responsible Statecraft really are pushing this line. I don't buy into.
I'm not buying it at all.
Because I mean, there's asymmetrical, but I mean, this is it's like you could say apples and bananas are fruit, but I mean these people are talking about apples and bricks. Okay, I mean, I don't see them.
No, I don't think so at all.
I don't.
Yeah, I really don't. I mean, it's I mean, it's like,
and plus, everyone, you send supersonic missiles to Yemen. The Saudis are not going to be too happy.
Well, that's the point. There's a very limited to what you can do with that, because since Russia has good relations with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, it doesn't want to mess up its relations, and they would be very upset about start giving them these long-range missiles.
No, what they're doing is what they're saying is that the Russians have very few options.
That's
okay,
right.
Being boxed in. Okay,
Right.
they're limited. Right. No, what George read from did you get that from the Kremlin.ru? The first thing we read.
The first one was from the Kremlin. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Okay. Well. Okay. I don't. That is nuanced, certainly, but it's very clear, and it is a guide to what to expect.
Right.
Okay.
That's right. So here's the post then goes on. Russian officials already appear to be placated to some degree by the United States' apparent hesitation so far to lifting restrictions on Ukraine striking military targets deep inside Russia using Western missiles. Where's the evidence that they're placated?
I don't know, George. I was hoping you could tell us.
Yeah, they're placated because the pattern seems to be that the Americans hesitate, and then they finally say, "Oh, all right, just stop nagging us all the time." But apparently the Russians are happy. Oh, well, they're hesitating, so that's all right. So all problems have been solved. The expectation was growing that if permission was granted, it would be very limited, analysts and officials said. Putin, however, is still under pressure to respond in some way and stop his red lines from being constantly crossed. I like this. He's coming under pressure. These apparently these you think some crazies putting pressure on him.
Well, everybody, those of you that follow this podcast, I think every single time a major development, and I think about it a dozen times, George, you and I have done this probably over the last couple of years talking about this.
Yeah.
I mean, this is not pressure. This is reevaluating the chess pieces
Right.
on the board.
Right.
Okay. I mean, again, I mean, this kind of projecting, Russian officials are like chickens with their heads cut off.
Yeah, that's it. What they want to present this image of somehow Russia, that you've got these crazies running around, some Lindsey Graham types running around Moscow, demanding, doing something stronger. It just doesn't work like that. And then it says, since the 2022 invasion, Russia has warned against the West supplying modern fighter jets like F-16, main battle tanks, and missiles to Ukraine, and each has eventually come to pass. Yes, but the thing is that in each of those cases, Russia didn't start talking about reevaluating its nuclear doctrine. I mean, it did say, hey, this is a dangerous escalation, and it has unforeseen consequences, but they never went this far. This seems to be a much more serious warning that's coming from Moscow.
Well, and also, George, I mean, I don't remember what was the first time we heard it, but that weaponry will burn just like the others. Okay.
Right,
But the reason why I'm saying that is that even though the West is escalating, Russia's been able to calibrate. But now we're going into long-range missiles being shot into Russia. This is a different category.
It's a very different category. Exactly. Because there you can still say, okay, these are weapons that will be used inside Ukraine. Yes, they're going to use them against Russians, but it's still inside Ukraine. But now when you're talking about long-range strikes inside Russia, particularly, and this is which particularly as they can only be done by the use of NATO personnel, NATO expertise, NATO technology. Ukraine cannot do this by itself. So therefore, it's essentially NATO striking targets inside Russia. That's a whole different issue from these previous examples. Putin is seeing a trend where Ukraine's Western allies keep allowing Kiev to expand its activities, said Tatiana Stanovaya, founder of the France-based political consultancy Art Politique. And the trend is scaring him, especially if it leads to increased missile strikes inside Russia. For Putin, this is a qualitative shift, which takes the situation to a new level and which could be followed by a further expansion.
Okay, what's this woman, Tatiana? Hey, listen up, Tatiana. Yeah, this is a qualitative shift.
It's a qualitative shift, exactly.
Because the West is qualitatively up the ante.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, we talked the other day about Boris Johnson when he was talking about, oh, yeah, lift all the restrictions on the use of these long-range missiles because Putin is bluffing. I mean, why would anyone think that you can just attack a superpower inside its territory and then and say, oh, well, it's bluffing? I mean, imagine attacking Idaho and Ohio in the United States and just think, oh yeah, Americans are just bluffing. They're not going to do anything about it. Yeah, just go ahead. Attack Illinois. No problem. They're just bluffing. I mean, what? I mean, how can anyone be that irresponsible? And then we have Moscow could opt to respond with sabotage operations against military targets or other infrastructure in the West, where Russia's participation could be difficult to prove. Why would they do that? Why can't they just simply attack directly targets in the West?
I mean, to
They
blame
don't
the
have to,
Russians.
try to hide their
So
traces.
you have
Just directly attack.
overt or covert action. Okay.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I don't. Why does it have to be this? Oh, covert. We can't possibly hide. No, I mean, since Russia's already issued these warnings, then why not just simply, yeah, a direct attack on air bases in NATO land. It could also turn to proxy groups that are already battling Western interests, like the Houthi militia in Yemen, that has been attacking Red Sea shipping, said Lawrence Friedman, emeritus professor of war studies at King's College London. I mean, but notice how it's just, this is the kind of delusional thinking of, we just want to believe something. Oh yeah, well, what they'll do is they'll just give some missiles to the Houthis, so we don't have to worry about anything. That's all they'll do.
It's really interesting too. I don't want to waste time on it, but the Houthi militia in Yemen that have been attacking Red Sea shipping. I mean, what is the context for them to be doing that? I mean, and what is the Russian connection there? Okay,
Right.
they're building something that's not there. Okay, and they're omitting a major point on top of it.
That's exactly it. I mean, there's no evidence at all the Russians are backing the Houthis. I mean, they haven't. The Russians have not backed the Houthis. I mean, again, the Russians have taken a very, let's put it, a kind of a fairly even-handed approach in the Middle East. By no means have they taken a particularly anti-Israel position, but neither have they taken an anti-Hamas position. I mean, basically they've sort of tried to maintain good relations with both sides. So why would they suddenly embrace the Houthis? It makes no sense. There's no record at all of the Russians embracing the Houthis.
And why would Russia need to embrace Yemen? I
No,
mean, they have
yeah,
their own patrons. Okay.
exactly. That's right. That's right. Um, and then it says, and then Sergei Markov, the hawkish Kremlin-connected political analyst, said there was a growing realization in the top ranks of the Russian military that Russia has spoiled the West, and that we have spoken a lot about red lines, but we haven't done anything yet. At some point, we will have to escalate. But I mean, what is just a hawkish political analyst? Okay.
I know him.
Oh, you
Okay.
do?
No comment. Go ahead. Keep going.
Markov suggested possible responses could include the closure of the British embassy in Moscow and strikes on air bases in Poland and Romania, where F-16s being deployed by Ukraine are based. Since Russia is sure that at some point strikes on Moscow will definitely happen, then we need to hit first. Yeah, well, that's what happens if you escalate. There's nothing totally unreasonable there.
Just closing the British embassy. I don't really know what that's going to do, but
Yeah, I didn't get that one either.
Like I said, I know him. Okay, keep going.
All right. And then while Stanovoya dismissed any such strikes on a NATO airbase as unlikely, and only in the case of desperation.
Well, what's the desperation? You're giving long-range missiles to Ukraine, operated by NATO land, to just kill Russians and destroy Russian infrastructure. What's the who's desperate here?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. and again, the assumption
and on top of it, George, it doesn't help Ukraine.
It doesn't help Ukraine, but the thing is, why would you think Russia will tolerate this? I mean, that just tolerate this indefinite. You can just keep hitting targets inside Russia, and this is NATO hitting targets inside Russia. This is and the Russians say, okay, fine, no problem there. We just don't want to get into a shooting war with NATO. Well, that's going to become a point and say, yeah, that where there's no real option if NATO keeps doing this. We just can't allow NATO indefinitely to think that it's basically Russia's a shooting range, and you can just hit whatever you feel like there. And then they say, well, the nuclear rhetoric does have its uses. Both Xi and Markov point out how members of the Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump's campaign have amplified Moscow's threats as a campaign issue. This week, Donald Trump Jr. And former independent presidential candidate Robert Kennedy Jr. wrote in an op-ed for The Hill that a decision to grant Ukraine permission to use Western long-range missiles would put the world at greater risk of nuclear conflagration than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and called for direct negotiations with Moscow instead. Now, notice the way the Washington Post casts this. There's a couple of weirdos talking such absolute, nonsense, obviously just echoing Russian
Yeah.
talking
This
points.
is just a Putin talking point. Yeah.
Yeah. I said, we are at greater risk of nuclear conflagration than in any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is what Biden said back in, I think, the fall of 2022. He said exactly that. We're now at the closest that we've ever been to a nuclear catastrophe since the Cuban Missile Crisis. So he didn't do anything to avert it. And here they say they write this article, and then they call for the direct negotiations with Moscow instead. Well, how horrible! What a terrible thing to do. Um, and then it goes on. Putin could seek to increase the threat and play a golden card by escalating before the election, Markov claimed. If Putin escalates, then the US will fear nuclear war and Trump will win.
Like I said, I know Markov. Okay, keep
Yeah,
going.
this doesn't Friedman also noted that Putin's nuclear threats were deliberately ambiguous to increase their sense of danger. It sounds menacing, but he never actually is very specific about what he's going to do. He allows us to make our own interpretations, and people interpret the worst. Well, it generally, presidents and generals don't tell you exactly what they're going to do. I mean, it's just not done to allow your adversaries to know what your next step is going to be. You make a general point, and then you take and then you assume that your adversaries will think
Well, I
about
don't.
and
Yeah,
respond accordingly.
yeah, but I don't really think you have to. You don't really need powerful interpretive skills to understand what Russia's policy is right now. I think it's pretty clear.
Good.
People interpret the worst. Well, I think you should just interpret at face value, at least
Right.
on this one.
I think so. I mean, exactly. He's basically said that there are serious consequences. Now, and then, as you said, you can then think about that. But again, if one always assumes he is bluffing, he didn't bluff um, before the launch of the so-called special military operation. He said,
My special card, I always play that one. Yep, you're
well,
right.
exactly. I mean, well, he's bluffing. Well, he wasn't. I mean, everyone assumed that he wouldn't do anything. I mean, that was the assumption. I mean, well, yeah. The Americans pretended to negotiate, and just going through the motions about on the two documents that Putin issued. They didn't take any of that seriously. But even though he warned repeatedly that we will take measures if you don't take our proposal seriously. So I mean, just to say, well, he's just bluffing. Let's just go on doing
Well,
what we're doing.
also, up until the attacks on the Crimean Bridge or the Kerch Bridge, the energy sector in Ukraine was left alone.
Right.
Okay, but they went for infrastructure, so they reacted. I mean, again, what bothers me is that this whole mantra about red lines. Well, a lot of these red lines are invented in the West. Putin wouldn't do that. Well, the Russians have never been really clear what they are.
Right.
And I find that to be troubling. I know George does too. Okay, but most of these red lines are the figment of
Right.
someone else's imagination.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Now, obviously, particularly Lavrov has come off and said there will be consequences for that. That doesn't necessarily mean a red line. It maybe
Right.
implies one, but it certainly it's more than an implication that there will be an escalation, and we have seen an escalation. So I think that somebody's got to write a dissertation on this. Whose red lines?
Right.
Okay, because these are more invented in Western media and the pseudo pundits.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. And it's clear that that by talking in this terms. I mean, this is not something. Oh, hey, I've got nothing to do this afternoon. Why don't we just simply have a meeting and say we're going to revise our nuclear doctrine? A good idea. And then we'll go and have dinner afterwards. This is a serious business. You know perfectly well that the rest of the world is watching this, and he's announced that we're basically lowering the nuclear threshold. Doesn't mean we're going to use nuclear weapons, but we're lowering. We're giving you a clear warning ahead of time that we're lowering the threshold on which nuclear weapons can be used.
Don't you? I miss Stephen Cohen so much, George, because if he'd seen this statement come out, he probably would have found a way to get himself on Tucker, which was at Fox then, and say, "Don't you realize what this means?"
Right.
But the reason why I'm bringing this up, missing Stephen Cohen so much, is that George, we do this hour in, hour out, every single week.
Right.
How many people? We don't have to name names here, but how many Russia experts are really Russia experts in your mind?
Right.
How many? Very few.
Yeah, I can't think of it too many.
Trying to be generous here, everyone. I'm trying to be generous, okay? But
but it's very interesting, because if you ask, well, who are regarded now as Russia experts, well, probably Catherine Belton, probably Julia Ioffe, Anne Applebaum.
God help us all. God help us all.
Exactly. There really isn't anybody who you could say, well, that's a Russia expert, somebody who has actually devoted his life to studying Russia and Russian politics and anything. No, I mean, it's just simply journalists who just simply get off with making wild statements. And let's say Julia Ioffe says, "Oh, Putin's just a bluffing." That's what he does. He's just a gangster bluffing. Oh, Julia Ioffe says this.
Yeah, I think one of her most elegant comments is that Russia is just the Soviet Union in a new suit.
That's right.
Okay.
That's
really helpful.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So I think basically just to summarize, I mean, this is a serious business. That's somehow the West should pay attention. I'm not saying the West will pay attention, but the West should pay attention to what Russia said. Russia's very patient. Well, because they didn't do something last week, and they didn't do anything yesterday, may not do anything next week or next month. That doesn't mean that all these things are off the table.
What's interesting here and extremely dangerous is George, as he forensically does, as he's wont to do, he goes to the original source and he read out what was said during that meeting. Now, how many people quoted that document? How many people used the text? No, these pseudo experts, they read it from somebody that might have read it or dreamed about it, thought about it, and came to their own conclusion, and then it's repeated. I find it when my early years in journalism, I noticed a story like from AP or Reuters, and that would just be repeated over and then it would morph, it would change. It was like kindergarten telephone line, okay? And did anyone look at this? The famous phrase, the worst the end of the Soviet Union was the worst catastrophe of the 20th century. Well, then George and I've talked about that numerous times.
Exactly,
completely taken out of context, okay?
Right.
And this is what we get.
Right.
These Beltons, did she actually read it? I mean, if she had, maybe she would have quoted it.
Yeah. No, it's always there that Putin gets quoted repeatedly, and no one actually even goes to the source material. Because what you just said about the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century, when he talks about what that was in that 2005 when he made that speech, and he explained what he meant by that. And
George put it perfectly. He bookended the Soviet era for Russia.
Right. That's right.
That's what the speech was about. Right. Nobody knows that except for people that watch this podcast.
That's right. Exactly. Exactly. So, Yeah, I mean, and again, when it comes to, people just say, oh, well, that's good. Well, next week we can go back to listening to what Boris Johnson has to say. And so, no,
Well, okay. Well, and of course, if long-range missiles hit the suburbs of Moscow and the Russians react by taking out an airfield in Poland, boom, he just woke up one morning and decided to
that's
attack
it.
Poland.
Exactly. That's it. Yeah, yeah. That's an unprovoked attack.
Unprovoked.
Unprovoked. It was, unprovoked.
And what's the other one? Massive invasion, full-fledged.
Yeah, is it full-fledged or something? Yeah, full-scale invasion or something like that.
The
Yeah,
massive scale.
yeah.
Al Jazeera does that every single time.
Right, right. Yeah, but no, you're absolutely right.
Full scale, full scale.
I think it's full scale. Yeah, yeah. But you're absolutely right, because when Stoltenberg, who repeatedly says this, he knows what he's doing. He repeatedly says, "Oh, NATO is not a party to the conflict. It means that, hey, any action taken against NATO in response to what NATO has been doing would be an unprovoked attack." Yeah, we can do whatever we can. We acting in accordance with international law. Supporting Ukraine, the right to defend itself. But we are not a party to the conflict. So if Russia decides to
but see,
attack,
your average fourth grader wouldn't understand that. They'd say, but the media class. Oh yeah, that's right. That's right. Like SEALs.
yes,
Yep, that's right.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. It was an unprovoked attack. Yeah, which that was always the one they kept saying. I haven't heard that one recently.
I've heard it for a while now.
Yeah, but it'll come back. But yeah, it was unprovoked. Russia's unprovoked.
Well, I don't know. I mean, if you look at the last edition of The Economist, I mean, they're showing a lot of gloom going on.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
It's pretty gloomy there.
Right.
So, I'm fully anticipating when everything is said and done, and I have no idea when that will be, but we stopped them. They didn't invade Paris. We won.
Well, that would be the problem that I always have with that is that, yes, they're gloomy. All these articles are gloomy about what's going on the battlefront, but they don't lead to the next conclusion. Well, then this might be a good time to open negotiations. So the fact that they don't,
or up the escalation.
Exactly, and that's really
that's where we are right now.
Exactly. That's why they don't
cut our losses, okay?
Right.
Or who's the president right now? I don't know. Where is he? I don't know. And you have these people that their lifelong ambition is to destroy Russia. They have this pathological hatred of a place that they have no idea that actually exists, but a place in their mind. And we got just a few weeks left. What are we going to do? Am I going to get fired by Biden? Ha! Jill's going to fire me? Ha! Okay. Yeah, no. I'm serious, everybody. This is a very dangerous period. It's one of the reasons why the Russians put this out, because I think they see intense instability going on right now. And if you're going to put your hopes and prayers into Kamala Harris, I think you should dig a bomb shelter.
Okay. I agree. And that's why I think the next 4 weeks are indeed very dangerous, because we really don't know what the Biden administration is going to do. I mean, ultimately, we don't know who's making the decisions. And they may have all sorts of tricks up their sleeve to basically maybe even to avoid having an election.
George, I mean, this is anecdotal, obviously, but I mean, one of the cabinet meeting that Jill chaired.
Yeah.
What's that all about? But he got really snippety. It was all on camera, about Putin. I don't think about Putin. Like an old man. He's, like snapping, because I'm not thinking about Putin. Of course, that's all you think about. Exactly. It's your legacy, Biden. This is
that was when
why these moronic Republicans, and we'll talk about it in a separate video, could never get on board with that. Well, they're paying for it right now. Okay.
All right. So we'll talk about it in the next video.
That was a teaser. Okay.
Yeah,
exactly. All right, everybody. This is the Gaggle with Peter and George. We're on Locals, so please go to thegaggle.locals.com. Today is Friday. George and I'll do our usual wrap on Sunday and live streaming on Monday.
live stream on Monday. So, and then always keep your eye on the prize, which is the tip jar. And these dogs are really getting into definitely into a foul mood with the tip jar situation. So if you have a few bob in your pocket, whip him out. See, so now he has to be forced to show up. I don't want to do this anymore.
Roll call, roll call.
Yeah, yeah, I got I got things to do. I mean, I got some bit busy. Unless you put money on the table, I'm not going to show up. So if you have a few bob in your pocket, whip them out, dunk them in the tip jar. We're very grateful for all of your help, friendship, and support. The more you're able to donate, the more of these videos we can make, the more we can improve on the technology. And above all, we might have, dogs that are not quite so angry in the future. I don't know about that. But remember, if you like the gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye-bye.